excited to have you guys joining us again. This is what the fifth night
Fifth
in a row.
night.
Yeah, so we hope that you guys are really receiving a lot of great information that is impacting and helping, your family's lives. And we're so excited about tonight.
We have a legend in the building. All right, guys, listen, man. This is a
Oh my gosh.
legendary moment. And as you come on in, whether you're watching us on Facebook or YouTube, come on in and let us know where you're from. Give us your name. Give us the city you're representing from. But this is legendary, man. We
Yeah.
have this is the
And make
one
sure you
voice
share.
we listen to. That's right. Hit that share button, man, because not only do you have questions about what to do in regards to the stock market, but your friends do. So don't be stingy with this information. Start to hit the share button, let your friends know that we are live and we're about to answer. We're gonna have a good discussion
Mm-hmm.
about how should we handle this
Yep.
because the stock market has been doing some historic things lately, not in a good way, and we need to know what should we be doing, how should we be handling all this. And so there was one voice that we wanted to hear from, and that is today's guest instructor inside of hashtag Stay Home You, because we all at home just about. And this is an opportunity for us to learn and grow and to get sound information, sound wisdom, right? Because you need to make good choices in this season. And so that's why we have the lineup that we do. And tonight is our favorite
Super
stock
excited.
investing guru. Listen, guys, y'all can talk about Warren Buffett all you want to. You can talk about Ray Dalio all you want to. The GOAT,
The
in my
McNeelys.
opinion,
Yes.
the GOAT when it comes to stock market investing for me and my
Yep.
household is J.L. Collins. He is the author of the one book that we recommend. Like, you all have asked us time and time again, hey, what's a good book to read if I want to learn how to investing? There's only one.
That we
It's
say.
called The Simple Path to Wealth by J.L. Collins. And so we are excited that we were reached out to him, and he was gracious enough to give us some of his time for this session because he's been through this. Like,
Mm-hmm.
this is not his first rodeo. He's seen some other economic downturns. And check this out, guys. Y'all have heard of the fancy term that has been coined called FIRE, right? Financial Independence Retire Early. JL did it before it was an acronym.
Mm-hmm.
Okay?
It's true.
He is the man when it comes to this stuff. And so this is the only voice we wanted to hear at this time. So, JL, welcome to Stay Home
Welcome.
University.
So happy to have you.
Well, thank you for the welcome. There's no way I can live up to that introduction, so I'm just going to ring off now and prevent it from going downhill from here.
Nah, nah,
But
nah.
thank you for having me. I appreciate the invitation.
We're glad
I'm
to have you.
excited to hang out with you guys and your listeners.
So here's the thing. What has been your reaction? Again, like we have previously stated, you've seen, this type of stuff before. It might have been wrapped in a different package, but you've seen such corrections and downturns in the stock market before. But for this, all this stuff that's happening right now, as you were first taking it in, what was your reaction?
Well, two reactions, one for the bear market and one for COVID-19. So the bear market doesn't bother me at all. In fact, I'm a little surprised that it took so long to get here. We've had a long bull run. There was technically a bear market in December of 2018 and dropped 20 plus percent and was back up so quickly, most people don't even remember it. So I've been expecting this for a long time. I've been telling my readers to expect bear markets. They're part of the process. It's like living in Chicago where you guys are, and being surprised by blizzards. If you live in Chicago, don't, blizzards may be difficult to deal with, but they should never be a surprise for you. But my reaction to, and every time a bear market comes along, something bad triggers it. And unfortunately, this bad thing is also killing people, and that's tragic. So the bear market, in my opinion, is par for the course. We'll get through it. The stock market will recover. It'll go on to new heights as long as we stay the course. We'll do fine and go on to build our wealth. I just wish that it had been a different trigger than this virus.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're getting a lot of questions. People are asking us, Ty and Talent, is this the opportunity for us to actually start investing? What would you say?
I'd I'd say absolutely, but I would have said that during the bull market. The time to start investing is when you've organized your life in such a fashion that you're living on less than you earn and you're creating a surplus, and that's the time to start investing. If you happen to be investing now, if you're starting to invest, or even if you're continuing to invest, this bear market, like all bear markets, is an absolute gift. My daughter, who is about to turn 28 years old, she invests every month in VTSAX, which is the total stock market fund I favor. And I was noticing that when she put her investment in for March, she got 19% more shares for the same amount of money than she got in February. That's what I mean when I say it's a gift. Bear markets are bear markets are the time when people really make money in the market, because if you stay the course and you keep adding to your holdings, you're buying them on sale, and the market always comes back. And if some point in the future that doesn't happen, then that kind of means that civilization is ended. As long as there's civilization and the United States is a viable country, the market will come back. It'll come back from this, and it'll go on to make us all wealthier. The only way you lose is if you lose your nerve and panic and sell, which I know from experience because that's exactly what I did in '87.
So let's take it
Let's
back.
talk about
Let's
that.
rewind
Yeah.
the clock because there's a reason that we wanted you here. There's a reason why you have legendary status in the personal finance world. It's because you figured out how to work a certain amount of time, a certain amount of period, and then save up enough money to be able to quote unquote retire for your remaining days. So for people who are like, this is their first introduction to JL Collins, can you kind of take us back to how you even came about with that knowledge back then? Because it's much more readily available now, but there was no talk of this in the 80s. So talk about how you even got there and the vehicle, because there's so many different styles of investing in the stock market, but you have honed in on a particular strategy that you use to propel yourself to be able to retire early.
Yeah, that's a question, Talent, that covers a lot of ground. So you're right. When I was young and coming up and trying to figure this out, it was wandering in the wilderness. There was no internet. There were no computers in the beginning. I didn't know anybody else who thought the same way I did. And I'm sure they were out there, but there was no way for like minded spirits to connect. And we're all kind of unicorns. I mean, we are still, the fire movement's grown quite a bit, but compared to the general population, it's still small. And my guess is it'll continue to be small. So I made a lot of mistakes on the way. And I achieved financial independence in '89. But to correct you just a little bit, retiring early was never part of the plan. It wasn't even a concept for me. It wasn't a concept that I'd ever heard of. And I liked working, and I didn't particularly want to retire, but I didn't like working all the time. I liked to be able to step away from jobs whenever I wanted because I would tend to burn out. And so I'd take self-created sabbaticals that would be anywhere from 3 months to the longest was 5 years. And I actually didn't even realize that I was financially independent when it happened. It was during that 5 year period, which started in '89 and ran up to '95. And also in that same period, our daughter was born. And when you have time on your hands, things like that happen. And my wife also had quit her job, so we were without income. And every year, at the end of the year, I would always take an assessment of where we stood with our finances. And about 3 years into this, I was doing that, and I noticed something remarkable, and that was that year, even though we'd lived the same lifestyle we'd always lived, we didn't cut back. Now it was a modest lifestyle to begin with. We had more money than the year before. And then I looked, and that was true of the year before that and the year before that. And I realized that something remarkable had happened. But as you pointed out, there was no internet, there was no community. I'd never heard the term financial independence, so I didn't have a name for it. But I knew it was something remarkable. But interestingly enough, somehow, and this is a little embarrassing, it never occurred to me what the implications of this were. It never occurred to me that it meant I didn't have to work again. And even if it had, I probably would have gone back to work because I liked working. But, it wasn't until I started writing the blog and suddenly I was hearing terms like financial independence and retire early. And I said, oh, yeah, that's what happened. That's the name for it.
So take us to the strategy, because there are lots of different ways that people can invest in the stock market. And for you, it was index funds that you saw as a viable option to build long-term wealth. What brought you to that decision? And if somebody's hearing that term for the first time, what's the difference between an index fund and everything else?
Yeah, so I started investing in 1975, which coincidentally was the same year that Jack Bogle founded Vanguard, and the same year he brought out the first index fund, which was the S&P 500 index fund. And that was a revolutionary idea at the time, and in some sense it still is. What Jack Bogle's amazing insight was that actively managing stocks was expensive, and it tended not to be very effective. And if instead of trying to decide which stock was going to outperform which other stock, if you just bought them all, you would get the market return, which was awfully good because the market does continue to grow and go up because you're investing in companies that are filled with people striving to make their company as successful as possible. And if you own a piece of that, that means everybody from the CEO to the factory floor is working to make you richer. And Bogle said, you know what? It's almost impossible to figure out who the winners and losers are going to be over time. And it's very difficult and expensive at best. I'm just going to buy it all. And it turns out that the research over the decades have proven that indexing, doing that, outperforms active management rather handsomely. And part of the reason is active management is more expensive and indexing is lower cost. And Bogle again had a great line. He said, performance comes and goes, but costs are forever. And so you keep your costs as low as possible, you buy everything. And then I have a term I coined, which I'm particularly proud of. The index funds are self-cleansing. So what I mean by that is you own the whole index. I prefer VTSAX, which is the total stock market index fund from Vanguard. It owns about 3,600 companies, virtually every publicly traded company in the United States. Some of them are going to fail. And as they fail, the worst they can do is lose 100%. But even before they get there, they're going to fall off the index. But at the same time, other companies are succeeding. And the limit isn't 100% to their success. It can be 200%, 500, 1,000, 10,000. The sky is the limit on the up, but going down, there is a limit. And every time a company drops off, new companies are always being formed in the United States and getting out there and competitive. And as they get big enough, they go public and then they get added to the index. And so I don't have to worry about which companies are going to win and which companies are going to lose. I own them all. And the ones that win are going to win much bigger than the ones that lose. Now, how did I come to indexing? That's a little bit embarrassing. So again, I started investing in 75. I didn't know about indexing at the time, even though that's when it started. And candidly, I would not have been smart enough to embrace it either. And I know that because when I finally heard of indexing in 85, a decade later, I was not smart enough to embrace it. And so it took me probably another 10, 15 years to see the wisdom of it. And what's interesting about that is I actually achieved financial independence picking stocks and picking actively managed funds that were run by people who could pick stocks. And the reason that's important is your listeners should understand that those two things, it's not like index funds work and those things don't work. Those things do work. They just don't work as well. And they take a lot more work and effort. And so you can accomplish the financial independence goal with actively managed funds and picking stocks. Many do. I did it. You're just going to work a lot harder and, in all likelihood, for substandard results. So had I embraced indexing further, or earlier rather, I would have achieved the goal sooner and with less effort. Reason it took me so long to embrace it, by the way, and I think this is an issue that a lot of people have, is it's so counterintuitive. It's you look at stock picking and you say, it's got to be easy to beat the index. It's got to be easy to beat. If I can just avoid the really obviously bad companies, I'll do better. Or if I can just focus on the obviously strong companies, I'll do better. But of course, the problem is the obviously bad companies are sometimes tomorrow's exciting turnaround story. And the obviously good companies sometimes turn out to be Enron and crater in a spectacular fashion. So it's a great deal of hubris to think that over time you can discern which are going to outperform which others. And that's why indexing works so well.
Yeah, you kind of hit a little bit on my question, where some people ask us, well, should we take a blended approach? Should we invest in index funds, but should we also do like individual stocks and things like that? What would you say?
I get that question a lot, and sometimes it's couched in the sense, well, of course I'm going to put my serious money in index funds, but I want to have some play money.
Yep.
5-10% of the portfolio to play with individual stocks. Look, I'm never going to tell anybody don't invest in individual stocks, and anybody who's inclined to do that isn't going to listen to me anyway. I do cringe a little bit at the idea of investment money being play money. To me, if you want to play with something other than your investments. I mean, I want my investments to be working all the time. But if somebody wants to, let indexing do the heavy lifting and buy the occasional individual stock because they think they can pick the next Google or Tesla or what have you, then more power to them. That's not what I do. I did that for a while when I was transitioning into indexing. I did exactly that because stock picking is addictive. There are few things that are more satisfying and exhilarating than looking at a company, analyzing it, finally pulling the trigger, buying the stock, and having it work and watching it go up. I mean, that's intoxicating. That's addictive. And if you're a stock picker like I was, that's hard to give that up. And so my transition, that's another good point, I guess. Even when I started embracing indexing, I didn't completely switch immediately. I was slow to give up my stocks. They were my pets. Some of them treated me well,
The
So
question
I
that
so
we're
I get
getting
to want to do that.
is it's kind of three-pronged. Should I take my money out of the market right now? Should I reduce my contributions to the market right now? Or should I be buying more right now?
Okay, so let's consider those options A, B, and C. Options A and B will leave you bleeding in the side of the road. So I tell people that if you're not willing to stay the course through bear markets, if you're not tough enough to hold on and not sell in a panic, don't follow my advice. Because if you sell in bear markets, you're going to lose money. And that's how I have a post and a chapter in the book, post in my stock series and a chapter in my book called Why Most People Lose Money in the Stock Market. And it's because they try to dance in and out. I have some commenters on my recent blog posts who are making the case for doing just that. It's something it's called timing the market, and it's extraordinarily difficult to do. If anybody could actually do that with any consistency, they'd be far richer than Warren Buffett and more lionized. It'd be the ultimate investing superpower. But nobody can time the market. You just think about what happened this week. If you rewind the clock to last Friday, a week ago, after that disastrous week, would you or anybody else have said, wow, Monday, we're going to Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, we're going to have the best up week since '09 or something? I mean, I wasn't hearing anybody who claimed to have a crystal ball saying that. So the market, one wag once said, the market will do whatever it takes to embarrass the most people. So if you're trying to time the market, you've set an impossibly hard task in front of you. So C, the last option you gave, is to stay the course, and ideally to invest more while you're doing it. That's how you make money in a bear market, and that's actually when you really set the stage for making serious money when the market rises. I've told my daughter, and I put a tweet out about this, a bear market, especially if you're young and building your wealth, is an absolute gift because you're buying shares on sale. As I said earlier, my daughter in March got 19% more shares for the same dollars than the month before. There's no other place in our economy where something goes on sale and we run away from it. If you have your eye at a beautiful coat in the local department store and say, wow, I'd really like to have that coat, but I don't want to pay that much. And then you see it go on sale, you don't run away from it and say, wow, I'm not going to buy coats. It's not selling for you. You say, wow, I got lucky. I'm going to go buy that thing. So, yeah, stocks are on sale.
Yep.
I love it.
I had a conversation with my niece in her early 20s. She's in her early 20s last week, and I told her the very same thing. I said, take advantage of this. Everything is on sale right now.
100%. So Listen, guys, we got the legend on the line right now, J.L. Collins. So if you're watching us on Facebook or YouTube, we need you to
share it,
the thumbs up, the hearts. We need you to comment telling J.L. thanks for this fantastic information, because he's giving up his time to help all of us. Yes, this is the real J.L. Collins on here with us, man. So I need to see some more hearts and thumbs up on YouTube and Facebook
right now.
All right. Yeah. So
I have a question.
Yeah.
Okay. I kind of had two questions, but let's do the first one.
Okay.
So you were doing this little dance, right? With index funds and still individual stocks. When did you finally put both feet in? And what made you put both feet in at that time?
Well, the second part of your question, Ty, is a little bit easier. I mean, what made me do it was just a gradual realization of how much more powerful indexing was, and that took a long time. And and so slowly indexing took over my portfolio. It was kind of the blob that ate the portfolio, and as I got down, and this kind of goes back to what we were talking about a moment ago, is when I got down to where, say 90% was indexing and maybe 10% was individual stocks, all of a sudden it occurred to me, even if I'm successful in choosing a company at this point, I'm not willing to risk enough to move the needle. So even if I go to all this work to pick a stock and it works, it's going to be such a small part of the portfolio that it's not going to move the needle. It's not going to make that much difference. And of course, it always has the potential of not working. So I think that was the trigger that finally made me, dust my hands of my last stock. Now, I'm pretty much past the addiction to this point, but like any addiction, there were many times I was tempted and I resisted to go back into it. The first part of your question was timing, and that candidly tests my memory a little bit. But I want to say, let me think about this. I started the blog in 2011, and I think even then I might have still had a couple of individual stocks. So it might have been somewhere around 2010, 11, 12, somewhere in there.
So I know a lot of people, there's a lot of people here that know who you are, that know your philosophy, that have built their portfolios based on your information, just like we have. But for some, they're hearing this information for the first time. They're like, okay, well, I should have been doing index funds. So they're going to start to look into index funds, and they're going to find a lot of different options. What is your advice on evaluating good index funds to put your money into?
Well, that's one of the nice things about index funds is you really don't have to evaluate them. What you do want, though, is a broad-based index fund. So right now, indexing has gone from, being a novel concept in 1975 that was roundly criticized at the time, by the way, and of course it was a threat to the high profits of Wall Street. So they tried hard to strangle it in its crib. But I've kind of lost my train of thought. Refresh your question.
A value for somebody brand new who's
Oh, yeah,
listening to your advice.
One, yeah. So what you want is a broad-based index fund. And by that I mean either a total stock market fund, which I described a moment ago, like VTSAX, which is Vanguard's, which literally owns every publicly traded company in the U.S., or the S&P 500 index fund, which owns the 500 largest companies. Those two, by the way, perform very closely. If you graph them, you'll see they track very closely together. The only difference is the total stock market fund owns mid-size and small companies as well as the larger companies, but in a relatively small amount because it's market cap weighted as they buy these things. So even VTSAX is roughly 80% the S&P 500. So that's what you want is an S&P 500 index fund or a total stock market index fund. Now, I prefer Vanguard, and I have pretty strong preference for Vanguard. We can talk about that if you'd like.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
But any other firm that is putting out a total stock market index fund or an S&P 500 index fund, they are the same thing because, again, they're buying the total market. So a total stock market index fund from Fidelity is going to be almost identical to the one in Vanguard. So if any of your listeners have something like that in Fidelity or an S&P 500 fund in Fidelity or another brokerage, they don't have to rush out and get rid of it and come over to Vanguard as long as you have that basic index fund.
Yeah, that was going to be my question. You have your Fidelity, your Schwab, your Vanguard. Why Vanguard?
So Vanguard is unique in the investment world in the way Jack Bogle chose to structure it. And that, by the way, is the reason that Jack Bogle passed away last year, I think, maybe the year before. And when Jack Bogle passed away, he was worth something like $300 million. Now, $300 million is a lot of money, but it's pennies compared to what he could have been worth if he'd structured Vanguard the way every other investment company is structured. Bogle gave up literally billions of dollars of personal wealth to structure it the way he structured it. And what I mean by that is, with Vanguard, the Vanguard is owned by you and me as the fund holders, as the shareholders of the fund. So Vanguard only has one master to serve, and that's us as investors. That's very different than Fidelity or T. Rowe Price. And I don't mean to pick on those two because that's true of all the investment firms. In fact, it's true of most companies. So Fidelity is a privately held company, and that is held by the Johnson family, and they probably have some shareholders outside the family at this point. So Fidelity has two masters. They want to deliver for their owners, for their shareholders, and they do that by trying to deliver for the shareholders of their funds. But make no mistake, the primary goal is to deliver to the owners of Fidelity. T. Rowe Price is a publicly traded company. It's the same thing, though. T. Rowe Price's primary goal is to deliver to their shareholders. Now, they do that by trying to provide good funds and performance to investors, because otherwise investors will all go away. It's the same thing. Maybe it might be easier for listeners to relate to it if we look at a company like Apple. So Apple is a publicly traded company. Apple is their main goal is to deliver shareholder value to the people who own shares of Apple. How do they do that? Well, they do that by manufacturing and selling iPhones and computers and what have you. And they try to make the best possible product they can. But make no mistake, they also try to sell it for the highest possible price and the highest possible margins, consistent with selling as many as they can. And that's because while their customers are important, they're not as important as the shareholders. Vanguard, the shareholder and the owner are the same. It's you and me. And that's unique in the investment world. Well, I think there's some insurance companies that are structured that way, but there are very, very few organizations that have that structure. And so Vanguard, as part of their core ethic, is to constantly drive down costs. And there'd be no point in raising the costs because that would just go into the pockets of the owners, which is us, the shareholders, and that would just make it a taxable event. So better not to take the money out at all. I hope that's clear. It's a little bit convoluted as I'm hearing it in my own ear.
So for the record, the fund that JL keeps recommending is the ticker is VTSAX. So V as in Victor, T as in Tango, S as in Sierra, A as in Alpha, X as in X-ray. If somebody can put those in the comments in Facebook and YouTube, VTSAX. But here's the thing, JL, because we've invested in that fund because you told us to many years ago on your stock series. We read your stock series like 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago and took action. Wow. But here's what we know. It takes a minimum of 3,000 to get into that fund. So if somebody's listening wants to get into a type of fund that you're describing, but they don't have the 3,000 right now, what's the alternatives?
Well, that's actually I'm working on a post about this very subject. So we just talked about how if you have a total stock market fund like VTSAX, and I can't think of the ticker for Fidelity's version, but if you have a total stock market fund in Fidelity, you own a total stock market fund, and that's a good thing. But most funds these days, most index funds anyway these days, have what's called an ETF version. An ETF stands for Exchange Traded Fund. And the ticker for the companion to VTSAX is VTI. And it's exactly the same portfolio. But because it's an exchange traded fund, instead of needing $3,000 to open it, like you do with VTSAX, you only have to buy one share. And just fortuitously, as I say, I was working on this post, so I happen to know that one share at the moment of it, I mean, at least I knew this, it's testing my memory now, it's about $60, $60, $61 a share. So if you have $60, $61, you can open VTI, and you now own the total stock market fund because VTI and VTSAX hold exactly the same portfolio. They're just, it's sort of like if you had two cups that were slightly different, but you had coffee in both of them from the same pot. It's coffee in the same cup. It's just one cup is shaped a little differently, decorated a little differently, and what have you. And there's some other differences between ETFs and mutual funds, but that's the post I'm writing. But the differences are, for the purposes of us, you and me and your listeners who want to be long-term investors, the differences really don't make any. There are no meaningful differences. So VTI is a fine alternative, and that's a question I get a lot. Is my 401k only has VTI. Is that okay? Well, yeah, but it's not only okay, it's great.
So that leads to another question too. Some people are going to go pull up, their options at their employers as far as 401k, and they're going to be like, well, JL said I need to do index funds. So how do they look through the sea of options that their employer is offering to see which ones may be index funds and may be good options to invest through the 401k?
That's a great question, and I have a kind of a cool hack for doing just that. And you're right, a lot of 401k plans have just an enormous variety of funds, and it's easy to get lost in the weeds. But if you look at the list of funds in your 401k plan, and you'll have a list of funds, and then you have a list of columns that say different things about the fund, that you read from left to right. One of those columns should be labeled ER, or expense ratio. And that's how much the fund charges you, because it costs money to run the fund. One of the beauties of index funds is they have rock bottom costs. So, You take your finger and you find that column and you run your finger down that column and you look for the lowest numbers in that column. You're looking for numbers that are like 0.05 or less. And you'll typically, as you run your finger down, you'll see, 0.52 or 0.39, or maybe in some awful funds, 1.6 or something. So you're just tracking down. You're looking, first of all, for the ones that are point 0 something. And then those are the index funds. And there probably will only be, 2, 3, 4, 5 maybe, depending on how many funds they have overall. So once you've identified those, then you can go across and look at the name of those funds and maybe even go online and look up the fund to see exactly what kind of an index fund it is. And again, what you're looking for is either a total stock market index fund, or more commonly, it seems, in 401k plans, an S&P 500 fund.
Are you a fan of bond index funds, or would you say have a little bit of both?
Yeah, I want to add on to that question because that's what I was going to go next. We're such a good team. Some of your proteges, indirect proteges, people that have come from under your teachings and have kind of, established themselves, written books and stuff like that. In addition to VTSAX, some have recommended bond fund, the total bond market fund, and some have said maybe you need to get the international version as well as an add to the mix. So, what is your feeling on adding things like bond funds or international index funds to the mix with the VTSAX, or is it ride the VTSAX until the wheels fall off?
Well, the answer to that question is kind of depends on where you are in your life cycle, whether you are in what I call the wealth building stage or in the wealth preservation stage. So if you're in the wealth building stage, like my daughter, my recommendation for her, and this is what I did when I finally fully embraced indexing and I still had a job and income, is VTSAX, because that's the most aggressive stance. That's the best long-term results. And when you're building wealth, you have that earned income, you're living on less than you earn, you're diverting some of that into your investments, just like my daughter is. That's how you take advantage of the volatility of the stock market. Now, when you quit work, you retire, and it doesn't matter what age you are. I mean, there are a lot of people in this community who are retiring at 30, 32, So retirement isn't a function of age for this conversation. It's a function of when you stop having earned income and you're living on the portfolio. And then most people, including me, want to have something else to smooth the ride because you don't have that income flow. And that's the role bonds play. And you're absolutely right. If you're going to own bonds, I'm a proponent of, it's VBTLX is the total bond market index fund. BND is the ticker for the ETF version. By the way, ETF stands for Exchange Traded Fund. I don't know if we mentioned that. So yeah, I do. Depending on the stage of life you're in, I absolutely recommend bonds, and total bond market fund is the way to hold them. It's the way I hold them.
Okay.
Is there a certain percentage? Is it a 80-20? That's one question. And if somebody is wanting to get started, how much would you tell them to start with? Is there a certain percentage of their earned income?
Well, I'm going to take that second question first because and just make sure that I understand what question you're asking. You're asking what percentage of their income should they be investing?
Yes.
Okay, so let's take that first. That really depends on how quickly do you want to be financially independent. Not surprisingly, the greater percentage of your income you save and invest, the faster you'll get to financial independence. What I did, and again, when I was doing this, I was wandering in the wilderness. I didn't have any guideposts, but just randomly, I picked 50%. I mean, from the moment I got out of college and started working, my first job paid $10,000 a year, and I lived on $5,000, and I invested the other $5,000 after paid taxes. But at that level, I'm not paying much tax anyway. And I've always saved 50%. Now, there are people in the FI community who save 60, 70, 80, 90%. I mean, they're very, very aggressive. So that's a very personal choice. It depends on how bad you want it and how quickly you want it and, how important it is. It's like making any other choice. To me, the most important thing my money could buy was my freedom. That's me. That was much more important than fancy cars and big houses and, wardrobes. It was my freedom. And so that 50% went to buy my freedom every paycheck. The first question you asked was, I think, more on the balance of between if you're going to add bonds to the portfolio, what the allocation balance should be. And that's a very, very personal choice. And it depends on your tolerance for volatility primarily. So the thing people have to understand is that bonds are there to smooth the ride, to reduce the volatility. So the more the volatility bothers you, the more bonds you want to have. But you have to pay a price for that. And the price is that bonds don't deliver the long-term performance of stocks. So the more bonds you have in the portfolio, the greater percentage long-term, the lower your performance is going to be. The higher percentage of stocks you have, the better long-term performance you'll have, but the rougher the ride will be. And that's you have to do what you need to do to sleep at night. But I'll add one caveat to that, and that is that you should never, in my opinion, have less than 50% in stocks, because if you do, you no longer have the long-term growth you need for your portfolio to survive the ravages of inflation over time. So the only thing I would say as an absolute is never go below 50-50. And then what you do between 50-50 on up is really a matter of how much you value performance as opposed to how much you value a smooth ride.
So we know that an index fund is a type of mutual fund, but it's not the same thing. So what is the difference between an index fund and a mutual fund, and why is an index fund better?
Yeah, so it's you said that well. So all index funds are mutual funds, but not all mutual funds are index funds. So basically, broadly speaking, let's see I'm trying to think of how deep in the weeds do we want to go. So a mutual fund is just, in the broadest definition, is money pooled from a large number of investors under some kind of management that then invested in something. So there are mutual funds, obviously, for stocks. We've talked about that. There are mutual funds for bonds. There are REITs, which are mutual funds that invest in real estate investment trusts. There's mutual funds for gold. So there's mutual funds for almost anything you can invest in. But if we're talking about stocks and bonds, which is the only thing that I invest in, you have two kinds of mutual funds. You have actively managed funds, and you have passive or index funds. And actively managed funds simply mean that you have a manager or several professional managers who are trying to pick stocks, or if it's a bond fund or bonds, that they think are going to do better than all the other options that are out there. And as I alluded to earlier, the research is pretty conclusive that long term, that rarely works. In fact, something, and I'm testing my memory here, but you go out 15 years and there might be 15% of them that outperform the index. You go out 30 years 15%. And it's less. Yeah, something like that. And you got 30 years, it's less than 1%. Wow. It's, outperforming the index over time, outperforming it 1 year or 2 years is much higher percentage. And by the way, that's what investment companies tout, right? So you see these ads in Money Magazine and, XYZ fund has beat the index for the last 5 years. Well, they cherry pick, they have dozens of funds, 80-90% of which underperform. But if you have enough funds, one of them is going to outperform, and that's the one that you promote. But the problem is that's probably not going to outperform in the future because, as we said, 30 years out, they don't. So you never want, there's a thing called chasing past performance. So just because a fund had great performance last year, or even the last 5 years, is not only no guarantee that that will continue, it's probably a good indication that it won't. Its time is about to run out. So, but actively managed funds are, they cost more money because you got to pay those managers. A passive index fund, it's passive because, again, it just buys everything in the index. And that takes very little management, and so there's very little cost associated with it. And cost is a constant drag on your returns to an appalling degree. Even, people look at a 1% cost and they say, oh, it's just 1%. But over time, that adds up to an enormous amount of money. And if you think about withdrawing, say, 4%, which is kind of considered a fairly safe withdrawal rate, well, if you're paying 1% in fees, you're giving up 25% of your income to pay management fees. That's huge. That's huge. So as opposed to paying 0.05% for VTSAX.
Talk to those who are listening right now and they're a little older. They're not in their 20s. We've heard people say in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, it's too late for me to even get started. What would you say to them, or what would your advice be to them?
So I would say two things. First of all, the moment you start saving and investing, from $1, you're better off than you were before. So every dollar you save and invest makes you that much fiscally stronger. You don't get to financial independence overnight. That takes time. But along the journey, every step of the way, as you're building your wealth, you get stronger. And that's critical. So no matter what age you are better off investing than not investing. So that's point number one. Point number two is, we went back to, I think, Talit, your question was how long does it take and savings rates. And, I said it depends on how quickly you want to get there. If you're investing 50%, it's about, if I'm, again, testing my memory, it's about a 12, 13-year journey. So, if you're just starting in your career and you're 22, that means that if you save 50%, you're probably going to be there at the age of 35. But if you're starting at the age of 35, it doesn't mean hope is lost. You just have another 13-year window. So you're going to be, 48. So if you're starting at 60, it doesn't mean that it's hopeless. It does mean you won't be there till you're 73. But if you don't start at all, you'll never be there. Yeah. And even if you're 70, you may not get there, but every step you take makes you that much fiscally stronger and that much freer.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good.
Ooh. So, here's the to wrap up.
I have a question.
Okay. We're not going to wrap up. My wife has a question.
I'm having way too much fun to wrap this.
Right, this is fun. Okay. I want to pretend, I'm sure you get this question a lot. If I were your daughter.
Because you do have a daughter.
Yeah, you do have a daughter. What was the advice that you told your daughter when she first got started? And at what age? Because some of us, we have children, right? And we have teenagers and young adults. So what would you say?
Well, so first of all, you have to let me indulge a story with that question. And that is that I pushed this stuff on my daughter's name is Jessica. I pushed this stuff on Jessica way too hard and way too early. And I turned her off to it. And, and I pushed it so hard because it is, in my mind, so critically important. A friend of mine by the name of Christy Shen writes a blog called Millennial Revolution. And Christy has I'm going to butcher this, but she has a great line. It's something effective. If you master money, if you understand money, life's incredibly easy. Incredibly easy. If you don't, life is incredibly hard. And of course, we all want our children to have the better life, better life than we had, an easier path. So I just pushed it too hard and I turned her off. But because I turned her off, I started writing letters to her that I wanted to have in case I wasn't around, that against the day that hopefully she'd be willing to hear this stuff, that the information would be available to her, even if I wasn't around to have the conversation. And I shared those letters with a friend of mine, and he said, this is pretty good stuff, and your family and friends might be interested in this. You should put it on a blog. Well, I never had any intention of starting a blog, and I'd heard of blogs. I'd never actually seen one. I joked that the first blog post I ever read was the first one I wrote. But so I didn't have any concept of building the international audience I have now. But I thought, wow, that's a great idea. It's a great way to archive this information for Jessica. So I started the blog, and I said, okay. And that's why the blog, by the way, has this very pedestrian name, jlcollinsnh.com, the NH being for New Hampshire, where we lived at the time.
And it's a fantastic blog, by the way.
Yes.
Yeah, but that's what
jlcollinsnh.com, guys.
Yeah, that's why I don't have a cool name like Mr. Money Mustache or Millennial Revolution or Go Curry Cracker. Anyway. So I sent it out to family and friends just because as long as it was there. And of course, they didn't care. They know me. I'm nobody. I'm not nobody special. So they didn't pay any attention. But then to my amazement, slowly it began to develop this audience. And I've always said, I'm not trying to persuade anybody of anything. There's only one person I've ever tried to persuade, and that's my daughter. And I can say that I've finally succeeded, and she's well on the path. But I'm delighted that other people find value in it to come along. So now I'm going to actually answer your question, which was what were the things that I told her to embrace early. And I think the core thing is that investing doesn't have to be complicated. Wall Street makes it incredibly complicated, not for the benefit of us, the customers, but because that's how they charge maximum fees. That's how they make it seem so impossible to deal with that, oh, don't bother your pretty little head with it. Just come and we'll take care of it for you for these fees. And they create products they don't understand themselves. That was one of the things that caused the big collapse in 07, 08. I liken it to a huge banquet table with all kinds of exotic foods on it. And in one tiny little corner, there's the simple, wholesome foods that you really need to have a healthy body and to live a healthy life. All those other things might be tasty once in a while, but they're not necessary. They're very complex. You're probably never going to figure out how to make them. Doesn't matter. You can put your arm on that table and sweep all that stuff onto the floor, because all you need is that little corner of healthy food. All you need is that little corner of index funds. And index funds are amazingly simple to understand. So that's point number one I told her. Point number two is VTSAX is the fund you want while you're young and working and building your wealth. Put as much money in it as you can, whenever you can. Ignore the market when it goes up. Ignore the market when it goes down. Just keep putting the money in because you're investing for the decades. Don't ever sell in a panic. Don't ever sell because of what the market is doing. The only time you sell is when the time comes to live on the portfolio and you draw a very little bit at a time over the years to meet your living needs. Stay the course.
Yeah, that's good. I have one more.
Go ahead, girl.
Do you recommend, because we get this question as well, people to withdraw money to put down on a home, to purchase a home?
Well, I think, first of all, if by withdrawing money you mean pulling it out of your index, yeah. So I don't recommend that. If you are saving for a home, money that you are intending to spend anytime in the near future, and let's call the near future within the next 5 years, that ought to be in cash or maybe in bonds. Because you don't want to take the risk, or most people don't want to take the risk of when it comes time to buy that house, having the market do something like it's doing right now and having to sell into. You never want to put yourself in a position where you have to sell or you want to sell into the teeth of a bear market like to buy a house. So I would say if you're planning to buy a house, you should start saving, but it shouldn't be in the stock market. So, in fact, I just have a post called Taking Advantage of Mr. Bear that I just put up where because the market I had investments in a taxable account, or VTSAX. We're nomadic, as we discussed, I think, before we went on air. We're recently thinking, at our age, maybe we'll buy a house and settle down somewhere. And before this bear market, I was looking at that saying, and if I have to sell this fund and to buy the house, I'm going to take a pretty good capital gains hit. Well, suddenly the bear market took care of that. And when it got down to the level where I could sell it with no loss, because I didn't want to take a loss, but also no gain, so I didn't have to pay any tax, I moved that money out of VTSAX and into cash, and just today I moved it into VBTLX to hold it, and for the next sometime in the next 5 years we'll probably buy a house. But now, to be clear, by the way, I would have preferred to have sold it and paid the capital gain, and I would have been better off then if Mr. Market had let me sell it and give the government their 20%, and they'd still have 80% that I don't have now of the gain. But one.
I think the temptation is out there. I really want to address this because you hit on it earlier.
Are you all enjoying this?
Yeah, I need
so
to know.
It's like we're sitting in his living room talking to him right now.
We're talking to the legend J.L. Collins, JLCollinsNH.com, author of The Simple Path to Wealth, the only book we tell y'all to read to learn how to invest in the stock market. But
you guys are great for my ego. I'm going to be unstoppable.
So that's what I want to know.
My wife is not happy with what you're saying.
What's pitched to us through marketing. We have whole networks geared toward picking stocks, and even mutual funds is advertised heavily. You don't see rarely any advertisement about index fund investing. And so the thought is, like, if you have a mindset to build wealth, like, I know I need to invest in the stock market, so let me read this magazine, that magazine, watch this network and that network, you're not going to hear about index funds. And so, like, you've made an incredible case, but it's like they've been given so much data about stocks in individual or mutual funds. And so now they're like, okay, maybe I should give this index fund thing a try. But it's a fight because it's not sexy. It's not what's put out there. Like, this almost sounds too easy. Wait, just pick VTSAX and keep putting money in it and just wait? That's what you're telling me, JL? So, like, if somebody's got that mindset, like, what do you say to that person if they were like, came to you with that type of thought?
Well, it's not surprising there's little or no advertising for index funds because, the investment companies don't make a lot of money with index funds. And again, Vanguard is different because it is structured to be owned by its investors, so its goal is not to make money for its shareholders. The only reason that companies like T. Rowe Price or Fidelity have index funds is they've been competitively forced to. That's another reason I prefer, and their heart really isn't in it. But indexing has become so popular because its superiority is becoming more and more widely recognized that if you're an investment firm and you're not offering an index fund, there's billions of dollars that are not going to come to your firm. Now, of course, what they're hoping is that you'll come in their index fund and then you'll be in their fold and they'll slowly but surely persuade you to go into their actively managed funds, not because it's better for you, but because it's considerably more profitable for them. And that's why those are the things that are advertised, because those are the things that make those companies profit. So obviously they're going to advertise the things that are most profitable for them. They don't necessarily advertise the things that are best for us. And I'm trying not to be too cynical here, but yeah, the Wall Street rarely pushes things that are best for the customer. It's all about what's best for Wall Street. So that's why you see the advertising for those things.
So we have people that are watching us that are currently in debt. What is your answer to people who are getting out of debt? Is it to hold off and not invest and get out of debt, or is it to also invest while getting out of debt?
So that's a kind of a big question. When I was writing my book, my editor, Tim, said, and I'd never written about debt because I've personally never had debt. And so I didn't feel particularly qualified to write about the subject. And my editor, Tim, said, no, no, no. And Tim had wrestled with debt himself. And so he recognized how important that issue was for an awful lot of people in a way that candidly I didn't. And he said, no, no, Jim, it absolutely has to be a part of the book. You absolutely have to write it. I did. It's also now a post on the stock series. And I capitulated and I said, well, I'll tell you what, I really don't know how to approach this because my lack of experience. So you outline for me, what you think this chapter ought to look like, and then I'll write it. And that's what we did. To me, the idea of having debt it's appalling. It's like being covered with leeches. It's the same. I mean, you've got leeches that are sucking blood from you. Well, that's what debt is. Debt is sucking blood from you. And so my advice is if you were covered with leeches, you take out your sharpest knife and you start scraping those suckers off. And when it comes to debt, that means in my world, you look at your debt and you figure out where you're paying the highest interest rates and you start paying those down first because that's the most expensive thing. This, by the way, runs counter to what people like Dave Ramsey teaches. Yeah, so Dave Ramsey teaches with debt that you should take the smallest debt you have, regardless of the interest rate, and pay that off because of the psychological boost of getting rid of it, and then go to the next largest. I kind of get that probably works for people, and if that's what works for you, whatever works for you to get rid of debt, then you do that. But to me, you should instead of adjusting the situation to what makes you psychologically comfortable, that is paying the lower debt off, you should adjust your psychology to accept what makes the best mathematical sense, which is paying the highest debt off first. So that's the bad news because you're going to have to live below your means. You're going to have to free up a bunch of money. You're going to have to go after that debt like your hair is on fire. But the good news is that that's going to take you a while, depending on how much debt you have. It might take you months, it might take you years. But in that time, you will develop an incredible superpower of living below your means and having the discipline to not spend money other than buying your freedom. And once that debt's gone, that's the same discipline that you need to begin building your wealth. You just take that money you were throwing to the debt, and now you start throwing it towards investments. And you're following my advice, you're going to throw it towards VTSAX. Now, having said all that, the question then comes up, well, what about mortgage debt? What about student loan debt? What about debt at really low interest rates? So is obviously a little different animal. If you want to own a house, most people are going to own a mortgage. I don't have a big problem with that. I'm appalled with student debt, not for the students who take it, but that we've created a system where 18-year-olds who probably barely know how to balance a checkbook are suddenly being put in a position of being able to take on hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt. I think that's unconscionable, but it is what it is. If you have student debt at a low rate, then maybe you pay that off a little more slowly. What do I mean by low rate? So my rule of thumb is if you have a debt that is the interest rate's 3% or less, that's pretty low interest rate. I would probably not be in a hurry to pay that debt off. I'd probably be more inclined to shift towards investments because you can probably over time do better than that. If your debt is 5-6% or higher, that's the hair on fire debt that you want to get out. You want to blow that out as fast as you can. And then the debt that falls between that, say 3 to 5-6%. Yeah, I guess that's a matter of more personal preference. I mean, for me, I have such an abhorrence of debt that, I'd probably get rid of it no matter what the interest rate was, but I'd certainly get rid of anything above 3%. But that's me. And if somebody said, you know what, Jim, I've got this loan at 4.5%, and I think I can do better long term in the market, wouldn't be my choice, but it's not the worst thing in the world.
So some people, you woke them up, right? They've been investing, but maybe they've been investing in what you aptly described as actively managed in or mutual funds. So the question is, well, they probably know I should probably stop doing that. But then the question is, do I leave that money there or do I try to migrate it over to an index fund like BTSEX?
Well, so that depends on whether it's in a tax deferred account, like an IRA or 401k, or in a regular taxable account. So if it's in an IRA or 401k, it's tax deferred. You can sell it and you can move that money into an index fund, and there is no tax implication to that. You won't have to pay a capital gains tax. If you own it outside of those vehicles in a regular taxable account and you sell it, if you have a capital gain, then depending on your income level, you will have you'll have to pay tax on that. I say depending on your income level because capital gains rates are anywhere from 0 to 20%, and the higher your income, the higher on that scale. Just like the higher your income, the higher your marginal tax bracket is. Well, the higher your capital gains bracket is. So some people might look at their tax bracket and say, "Wow, I make little enough money that if I sell this, even if I have a capital gains, it's going to be taxed to zero rates." So you kind of have to look at the tax code about that. But here's another illustration where bear markets can be a gift, because if any of our listeners are in that situation, while it's been brutal to watch the value of those funds go down, it does make it a better change if you intend to make that change, because there will be less tax consequences, obviously, because a lot of those capital gains have gone away. And then you're buying into that index fund at an equally low level. So you're positioning yourself for the next rise in the fund you want to be in. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we have a lot of questions. Do you have time just to answer a few more questions from
Hey,
some of the?
you should know by now it's hard to get me to shut up.
Okay, well, good, because everybody's asking a ton of questions.
All
So
right.
guys, we're gonna just pull a few of them out, ask some really good ones, and
Well, one common one we're getting is, okay, how do I get started? So like step 1, 2, and 3, I contact Vanguard and I do what?
they have great customer service, by the way.
Yeah. So if you want to, if you're starting from ground zero, or if you are invested somewhere else and you want to move to Vanguard, or you're invested in actively managed funds and you want to make that transition, I would pick up the phone. As you just said, Vanguard has good customer service. I just pick up the phone and say, look, I'm at XYZ company now, and I'm in these funds, and I'd like to move over to Vanguard, and I'd like to be in VTSAX and VBTLX or whatever your preference is. Or you can call them, and if you're just beginning and you've saved some money up, however much it is, it's $500, $1,000, whatever. You can call them up and say, I've got $1,000 I want to invest, and I want to buy VTI, the total stock market ETF, and they'll be happy to walk you through the steps. So the mechanics of this, nobody should worry about. You should worry more about the philosophy of how you want to approach your investing. The mechanics of actually buying this stuff and selling it couldn't be easier. Same thing applies, by the way, to your older listeners or maybe even your younger listeners who are about to live on their portfolio, and they're like, well, how do I begin withdrawing this money? You call Vanguard or actually any other investment firm you're with, and you say, I own this fund, and I want you to begin sending me this much money each month. And assuming that there's enough money for the fund to do that, then they'll say, sure, we'll set that up, and they'll send you 500,000, 10,000, whatever you specify. But they know how to do the mechanics. You don't have to worry about it. You just call them, tell them what you want to do, and they'll take you through it.
So we have someone asking, what about the investing apps like your Robinhood or Stash? What are your thoughts on those?
Well, I'm not familiar with either of those, so I can't comment.
Any investing apps in general?
I'm afraid I'm an old school.
That's what I was about to say. Yeah.
I guess I would basically say, and I may be doing the apps may have some value that I'm not aware of. But again, the title of my book is The Simple Path to Wealth. Simple is the bottom line. So you don't need apps to do any of this stuff. You don't need apps to follow my simple path. You just need an account at Vanguard, and once you have the account at Vanguard, you can log on. I'd have to know more about the apps before I dismiss them completely. But I've never had them, and I've done all right.
I think the heart of that question was because they don't have the 3K to jump into VTSAX. So, but you've already mentioned the fact that if you don't have the 3,000, that's the minimum to get into VTSAX. You can use the ETF version, which is the ticker is VTI, Victor Tango India, and you can get in for whatever the current market share is. So with index funds, you're buying into the fund, but with the ETF, you're buying shares. So it's a smaller way to get into, and they both hold the same companies in their portfolio. So if you don't have the $3,000 minimum to get into VTSAX, then you can use Vanguard's VTI exchange traded fund to get the same, to get your money invested in the same set of companies. I hope that.
Very, very well said. Very well explained.
Well, I learned from the best.
Yeah. He was going around the house today like, oh my gosh, we did everything he told us to do.
Yeah.
I said, okay, I love that.
But you said it even more eloquently than I could have. So.
Someone is asking about REITs, REIT stocks.
REITs.
Yeah. What are your? Please talk about that. Is what he's saying.
So REIT stands for Real Estate Investment Trust, and basically a REIT is a mutual fund that invests in real estate, and most of them specialize in. Some of them specialize in apartment buildings, some in commercial properties. There are index funds. There are REIT index funds that will invest in the total REIT market. Or I used to actually be in REITs, and I stepped away from REITs. When you own VTSAX, you own REITs as well because they are part of the index. But when I owned the REIT index fund, I owned it as an inflation hedge. And what I came to realize is that regular stocks are a pretty good inflation hedge. And I really didn't need the REIT. And when I continued to own it, what I was really saying was, I think that REITs, real estate, is going to outperform all the other different kinds of companies. So REITs are going to outperform gold, and they're out going to perform oil, and they're out going to perform tech and everything else. And I realized that I had no reason to think that they were going to outperform. I didn't, I just didn't know. Just like you don't know what direction the stock market's going. So once it didn't serve the purpose of being an inflation hedge for me, then it was just an overweighting in real estate in my portfolio that wasn't serving a purpose. And because I wasn't expecting them to outperform, I stepped away from them. But that's what REITs are. A lot of people like them, by the way, because they tend to pay pretty high dividends. Mm-hmm. So if dividends are important to you, that's one of the things that people like about REITs. But I don't own them anymore.
Somebody said, so should we nicely fire our financial advisors and work directly with Vanguard?
Yeah, I have both in the chapter in the book and in the stock series on the blog, I have a chapter and a post titled "Why I Don't Like Investment Advisors." Now, in fairness, there are some good investment advisors, and since I've started writing this blog, almost 10 years ago, I've met some of them because they're in the space. But investment advisors in the best of circumstances, add an extra layer of expense onto your investments. A lot of them are not very good. They're not very good because they're not actually that skilled at what they're doing. Their interests are in conflict with yours. So they are much better off if they put you in high cost funds than in index funds. So it's always a dangerous situation to put somebody in a position of acting in your best interest when it's not aligned with their best interest. So if you're going to use an advisor, I would say make sure it's a fee-only advisor, so they're not being paid with commissions, they're not being paid a percentage of your assets. So to give you an example of a potential conflict of interest, you might have an advisor and you're invested with them, and you have a mortgage on your house, and you go to your advisor and you say, I owe $200,000 on this house. I'm thinking of maybe, selling some stock and paying off the house. What do you think? Well, you put your advisor in a tough position, because that might be the best thing for you to do, to buy the house, but it's definitely not the best thing for the advisor, because $200,000 that they were earning commission on, getting a management fee on, has just walked out the door. So it's going to be very hard to get objective advice on that score. So again, if you're going to use an advisor, pick them very carefully, pick a fee-only advisor. And that's very hard, by the way, because most people, the fee-only advisor, you got to write a check, and that's hard. Whereas, advisors who are collecting commissions and a percent of assets, you never see that money going out of your pocket. It goes out of your pocket in much larger amounts than the fee-only thing, but you don't see it. And so it's not as painful as writing that check. The other last thing I'd say is, there are good advisors out there, but being knowledgeable enough to tell the difference between a good one and one who's not, by the time you develop that knowledge base and skill level, you could develop the knowledge base and skill level you need to manage your own money. And that's where I'd put my attention.
Yeah, that's what we've done. I think this is a very important question. How can one figure out or calculate the amount of money that they're going to need in financial independence? And how much should they look at with drawing down once they do reach that time when they do need to start living off of that money? So how can they calculate the number?
So actually calculating the number is a pretty simple bit of mathematics. But it's underpinned with some research. So back in the 90s, I think there was something called the Trinity study that was put out, where they looked at a whole, and I'm trying to think of how deep in the weeds to go with this, but they looked at a whole different range of scenarios. And we can talk about this in depth if you'd like, but basically when they looked at all the data, they found that if you had a portfolio and you drew 4% a year, and every year you adjusted that for inflation, 96% of the time that money would last at least 30 years. So they only had a 4% failure rate. And that 4% withdrawal rate became known as the 4% rule. And as you guys probably know in the FI community, it's hugely controversial as to whether 4% is the right number. And so I think of it, I don't know that it's a rule, it's a great guideline. So how does that work mathematically? Let's say you need $40,000, you've tracked your expenses, you know that you need $40,000 to live on. 40,000 is 4% of $1 million. So if you have $1 million in investable assets, then you're financially independent, because that'll throw off $40,000 a year. And in all but the worst possible scenarios, that is going to last you at least 30 years. By the way, if you look at the Trinity study, what's really stunning is not that it failed 4% of the time, but how often not only did it succeed, but at the end of 30 years, you wound up with a spectacular amount of money. I mean, millions of dollars above where you started. So the 4% rule is actually, in my mind, 4% is a fairly conservative number. The other way to calculate it, by the way, is let's suppose you say, well, I'm not living on a nice round 40,000. I've got some weird, I'm living on $42,938.62. Well, if you multiply that number by 25, you will get the number you need to have invested to generate that number. each year at 4%. And then, like we were talking about asset allocation, it becomes a matter of risk tolerance, right? So some people say, well, that 4% time that it fails, that scares me to death. And maybe particularly in a bear market like this. So maybe you want to be a little more conservative and say, I'm going to go to 3%, and that means you're going to have to save more money. On the other hand, I've had people that I've talked to that have said to me, Jim, I'm in the job I'm in is soul crushing. I can't stand it. It's killing me. I've got to get out, but I need 50 grand a year to live on, and I've only got $1 million. And, that's a 5% withdrawal rate, not 4%. Turns out, if you look at the Trinity study, 5% has a success rate of like 92% or something. If I'm in a soul crushing job, I'm going to take that gamble. And if things happen to go against me, then I'll go to plan B. I'll find a part-time job or something. So let's suppose you did that and suddenly you realize, yeah, I should really only be pulling 4%, that 40,000. Well, go find something to do that throws off 10 grand.
Yeah.
Because if you can find a part-time job that throws off 10 grand, that's the equivalent of $250,000 of invested money.
Good.
So another question was, is there an opportunity loss during a bear market by holding an index fund that's declining in value?
Well, the assumption behind that question is that you can predict the future. So certainly if there is a bear market, if I'd had a crystal ball, I forget when this bear market began exactly, but if I'd had a crystal ball then, and I knew the bear market was coming, I certainly would have sold and not seen my holdings drop by a huge amount of money. But I don't have a crystal ball. And if I'd done that, then I would also have to decide, well, when to get back in. So as I mentioned earlier, there's some people in the comments section on some of my recent posts who have said, hey, that's, doing what you're doing, holding while it keeps going down, that's just stupid. I'm going to sell. And they've done that. They've sold at a loss. They've stepped out. But I'll bet they didn't see this big week coming. They didn't say that. Nobody that I saw predicting things were predicting that this would be one of the biggest up weeks since 2009. And the corollary is nobody knows what's going to happen next week. We all have our thoughts. I have, but I don't know. Nobody has a crystal ball. So sure, if you were able to know when it was going to start to go down and get out, and then know when it had got to the bottom and get back in, or even approximate those things, that'd be a superpower. Nobody has that superpower.
All facts.
Yeah.
So, guys,
yeah,
the entire blueprint, everything that JL has shared is in the book. It's called The Simple Path to Wealth. I don't know when Amazon gonna get it to you, but you can order it. I'm sure they got the audio that you can listen to right away, or the Kindle that you can read right away. But he has the entire blueprint in the book. And he also has an amazing blog called JL Collins NH, which stands for New Hampshire. I did not know that. I've been reading it all this time. Did not know what the N and the H stood for. JLCollinsNH.com. What can we say? The legend did legendary things on this evening. And he gave us a great bit of information and knowledge to help us all, first of all, understand what's going on currently and how we should react to it and what we can do moving even past this event.
JL, did you have any closing remarks? Maybe there was a question that we did not ask. Is there any closing remarks that you want to leave with everyone that's viewing this?
No, but first of all, you asked great questions, and the questions from your listeners were awesome too. So I can't think of anything that I would add that we didn't cover. To Talat's last comment about the book, I would say there is nothing in the book, by the way, that is not on the blog. That's not in the stock series. So the book has the advantage of being more concise, a little better organized. I won't say the writing's more polished, but I spent more time polishing it. So I'll leave it up to the readers to decide whether it's more polished. So nobody should feel that they've got to go out and buy the book to get the information. It's all for free on the blog. It's in a lot of libraries, so you can go and then if you read the blog and you like it and you want to own the book to have a more concise reference, or you get it from the library and you read it and you say, wow, this is something that I'd like to own so I can, then that's great. But you don't have to buy the book to get the information, and that was by design. It's interesting if you look at my Amazon reviews, some of the 1 and 2 star ones. They're critical. They're like, there's nothing in this book that's not on the blog. That's by design. I don't want people to pay for the information. So again, the book is a little more concise, a little better organized, but the information's for free on the blog, and certainly the book's for free in libraries.
Yeah, you're so kind. But we do have that book here in our personal library at home, and we plan on passing it down to our children. Matter of fact, they may need to start reading that next week, since we're at home and teaching them anyway.
Wait a second. You mean you haven't bought your kids their own copies?
Well, we have a family copy in our library.
Yeah, they're little. They're little.
It's never too early. You could turn your kids off like I turned my kids off. Just push them too hard.
Exactly.
All right, guys.
This is great. You're getting so much love. Everybody is saying thank you.
Everybody's showing you a lot of love in the comments.
This is exactly what I needed. So, yes, thank you so much. We really appreciated this.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I had an absolute blast hanging out with you guys. So the pleasure was all on this side of the screen.
All right, everybody, hit that share button real quick so your friends can see. You just got hooked up with a value-packed hour and a half of information. Do not keep this to yourself. Hit the share button, tag your friends, tell them JL just came through. The legend just dropped a bunch of knowledge and you need to check it out. And again, JL, thank you to
so
everybody
much.
who was on the broadcast tonight. We hope you took good notes, and we hope that you about to go get to work.